Hey y'all, what's up? Welcome to ENL 3 Intro to Literature and Literary Studies, Being Human in a More Than Human World, Week 3. Um, so far, I think we've read some pretty awesome poems by a variety of poets, mostly modern and contemporary poets, with the exception of Whitman, of course. And now we're transitioning into, for the next 2 weeks, we'll be reading a single poet. We're going to be reading much of this book, Blood Dazzler, by Patricia Smith. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the book, about Patricia Smith, about the project she's working on in this book, and then about some of the stylistic devices and themes and concepts we'll be digging into as we read this book. It has come to my attention that maybe some of you have gotten an ebook version of this book instead of a print version. I'm still learning how the early adoption system through the campus bookstore works. So I've posted the page numbers of the poems that I want you to read for this week and for next week on the syllabus. But if that doesn't work for you, if there aren't page numbers in your version, please just somebody email me and I will go through and write down the titles. Mostly, like, a ton of these poem titles are dates and times, and I didn't feel like transcribing them, but I'm happy to do it if you all don't have access to page numbers. So just let me know about that. Cool. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Patricia Smith and Blood Dazzler, and in particular about in poetry in general and in Smith's project, the speaker of the poem, persona, and voice. So that's going to be some of the stylistic devices we're going to dig into this week. Cool. Patricia Smith got her start as a slam poet. She has been described as the winningest slam poet of all time in poetry slam contests. She won a ton of national poetry slam championships back in the day. She was one of the first superstars of the poetry slam spoken word world probably in the 90s. And in particular, she was widely known for her persona poems, for poems that speak in the voice of a character or person or maybe non-person who is not herself. So she has a famous poem, you can look it up on YouTube, called Skinhead, where Patricia Smith is a black woman and she speaks in the voice of a white supremacist. And she wrote that in like the 90s or early 2000s, maybe, I'm not sure exactly, but like a slightly different political moment than we're in now. And it was like a really powerful poem. You can look it up. I just, want to give you a warning. If you watch it, it's a little violent, it's a little intense, it's uncomfortable, and it's supposed to be. So yeah, that's a little bit about Patricia Smith. I grew up loving her work. I come from the poetry slam world as well, so I was a big fan of hers. And she's one of the first people who successfully made the transition from being primarily known as a spoken word artist to being primarily known as a page poet or whatever you want to call it, as a poet who publishes great books with reputable publishers of poetry. And she's won a ton of awards and stuff like that as well. And she's just a wonderful poet in general. Cool. So this book, Blood Dazzler, I think it's her third collection of poems, maybe fourth, I don't know. She has like 5 or 6 now published. This one came out back in, I think, 2008, 2009. And it focuses entirely on Hurricane Katrina and on what Hurricane Katrina did to the city of New Orleans and the community there. Teaching this book last year, I found out that like most students no longer really remember Hurricane Katrina. Y'all are young enough that that's a thing that happened kind of before you were memory holding beings in the world. So the book says everything you need to know about Hurricane Katrina, really, but I just wanted to talk about a little bit that, like, how monumental of a historical event it felt like in the immediate moment. It was one of the first, by my memory at least, one of the first major like superstorms or whatever that like really devastated the U.S. And the racial and economic disparities of the city of New Orleans were like exacerbated by the hurricane, and were like the the effects of the hurricane were really unevenly distributed, really hit black communities and impoverished communities a lot harder than it hit wealthier white communities. And so it brought out a lot of tension there. And the ways that the city, the state, the country, and the media responded to and talked about the hurricane also like underlined racial disparities. So there was this moment where before Kanye West was the character he is now, he's just like a good rapper who had like slightly liberal perspective on things, and that's like what he was. And he was like still like kind of egotistical, but not the way he is now. Anyway, there was like this benefit concert on live TV to raise money for the city of New Orleans in the wake of the hurricane, and Mike Myers, the dude who played Austin Powers, was hosting with Kanye, and they're on the screen together, and Kanye goes off script, and he's like talking about, he says, "I hate the way they portray us in the media when it's pictures of white people, they say they found food, and when it's pictures of black people, they say we're looting and stealing." And you can see Mike Myers get really uncomfortable, like, oh, this isn't in the script, but he wants to be supportive, and he's like nodding his head. He's like, yeah, that's like a problem. And then Kanye West is working up, and he's like, he just kind of interrupts himself, and he says to the camera, "George Bush doesn't care about black people." And that was like a huge thing to say at the time. This would like, the political moment was slightly different. Critiques of the president were not as vehement as they are now. They were still vehement, but like not in the same way in the Trump era. Trump era ending very soon. Cool. Hopefully. Losing my train of thought a million times. Yeah, so, and that was like a huge deal, and everybody was like shocked that he said this on live TV, and that was proof that Kanye West was awesome, and he has become a much different kind of person these days, which is sad to me, because I really liked him back then. So it was like, Hurricane Katrina was a major public event, not just kind of foretelling what was going to happen with climate change and more superstorms, but also just the destruction of a city that underlined racial and economic disparities. And so that's the context that Patricia Smith is writing into in this book of poems. Notably, Patricia Smith is not from New Orleans. She's not from the South. She was not, as far as I know, personally like present during the hurricane. And so she's a Northerner. She's from Chicago and Boston, I think, primarily. And some Southern poets have raised questions about why is Patricia Smith writing this book about what's a Southern issue, an issue specifically for Louisiana and New Orleans to deal with. And I think that's a great question to think about. But I also think it's a wonderful, powerful, beautiful book. And I think Patricia Smith has a skill for writing into the perspectives and experiences of others. And I think that's what we're studying as we look into this book. Cool. So, persona and speaker. You will hopefully notice that many of the poems in this book are written in pretty clear personas, or they speak from the voices of different characters. There's poems in the voice of New Orleans. There's poems in the voice of Hurricane Katrina itself. There are poems in the voice of people who experienced the destruction of the hurricane. And I think those are the main voices. I don't know how many poems are really in a voice that we would definitely say is Patricia Smith, the individual, and not some other character or like larger than life force like a hurricane. So, and that's important to touch on. I think that's I'll know you didn't watch this video if in your post you don't seem to understand that she's writing in the voice of the hurricane, for example, if you choose one of those poems. But why say that here? Because if you're watching my video, you're watching my video. So the people who are going to do that aren't even getting this warning. Yeah, still learning about how online teaching works. Yeah, and so my questions in the discussion post forum for this week ask you to think about persona, speaker, voice, as these are some main tools that a lot of poets use in very different ways to accomplish their goals. And Patricia Smith in particular is known for her use of these stylistic devices or literary devices. So persona, speaking in the voice of a character or being who is not yourself. We've already read some persona poems, or at least one comes to mind immediately. I'm not looking at the syllabus. But Sylvia Plath's Mushrooms is a notable example and a thing to kind of think back on. A lot of you noted in writing about it that she's obviously speaking in the voice of mushrooms. Plath uses the first person plural, we. We hold our, I don't remember the lines of the poem. Hold our noses, is that a line in the poem? Acquire the air. So she's speaking in the voice of mushrooms, but a lot of you noted that there's kind of an extended metaphor in that poem, that the persona of mushrooms allows Sylvia Plath to simultaneously talk about issues facing, some of you said women as an oppressed or silenced group. Some of you said minority groups. Some of you said just oppressed groups in general. And there's been some discussion about what exactly she had in mind. I think people who know Plath as a poet say she was probably writing about the experiences of women. But nevertheless, she's writing about the experiences of mushrooms. And at the same time, through that persona, saying something about what it means to be a silenced and oppressed group who is coming together, building community, and trying to inherit the earth meekly, right? So I would ask questions about what Patricia Smith is doing with persona in these poems. First of all, what stylistic devices does she use to effectively speak in the voice of a hurricane, for example? How is the hurricane's voice different from New Orleans' voice, or the voice of a human, or whatever? What distinguishes it as a voice? And then also, why does Patricia Smith speak in the voice of a hurricane? What does that allow her to accomplish? Is she simultaneously also talking about experiences of some human group or individual? Does speaking metaphorically as a hurricane allow her to say something about herself, or to tell us something about ourselves that we couldn't exactly see in the same way if we weren't thinking about hurricanes? Those are the kinds of questions I would ask. What is this persona doing, not just as a hurricane, but as a larger way of talking about some kind of core experiences or themes or ideas? And that's that thing I said in one of my discussion posts I want to talk about this quarter, is like what I think of as reading on another level, looking at the literal level. Literally, this poem is a hurricane talking about its desire to swallow the land or to be named or whatever. That's what's literally happening. But what's happening on another level? What's happening psychologically, emotionally, symbolically, even spiritually? What is it doing for us beyond just the literal narrative of the hurricane? Cool. So those are questions about persona, about why Patricia Smith is using these personas. Another set of things to think about is the question of the speaker of the poem more generally. Here, the speakers of the poems are like pretty clearly fictionalized characters, whether hurricanes or cities or individuals. But when we're reading poetry more generally, the reason we talk about the speaker of a poem rather than like substituting the name of the author themselves is because poets often kind of make up characters or voices to speak from who are not exactly themselves. My camera, my phone is telling me that it's running out of battery and it's going to die soon. So maybe I should wrap it up. We talk about, the same way we might talk about the narrator of a piece of fiction, we talk about the speaker in a poem. Because it's not always the poet themselves, not only when it's very clearly not the poet, like in Patricia Smith's case, but even in other poems. We might say, I don't know for sure that Seamus Heaney was obsessed with water wells as a kid, but the speaker of his poem certainly is. And it doesn't really matter if it was Heaney himself, because I'm reading the poem and not like an autobiography of Seamus Heaney, right? Cool. And finally, there's the question of voice. What stylistic devices, what word choice, what rhythms, what syntax, what focuses, what perspectives, what ways of seeing the world contribute to creating like a realistic voice on the page. All Patricia Smith has here is the words on the page, and she has to convince us that she's a hurricane and also a woman writing in the voice of a hurricane, and also build the other themes and ideas and concepts that are at work in her poems. So yeah, that's that. I look forward to seeing what you have to say about these poems on the discussion forums, the discussion post this week. Just a reminder, you also have to read the essay assignment. I posted the essay assignment to the module this week, and I highlighted like the key, most important parts, because I know I write really long assignment sheets, but I insist that you read the whole assignment sheet, but the highlighted parts are for you to see like what the clear-cut requirements are, and the other stuff is more like tips and suggestions and strategies and stuff like that. So if you have any questions about the essay assignment, about Patricia Smith's poems, about the discussion posts, about anything else, as always, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to answer you via email or try to find a time to meet with you on Zoom if it works for both of our schedules. Cool. Other than that, I look forward to your posts, and I will talk to you again soon.